Yes. So it's great to see you all here. And I'm also very happy to and honored to have been invited by Full Circle. I mean, by Louise and Bridie and Elena, who've been taking really good care of me since I arrived in Brussels this morning. I'm going to be here until tomorrow, and we have a few things taking place there as well. But this is the main event and the big event that I've been looking forward to the most, because we all enjoy talking about things about which we feel passionately, don't we? And this is one of my passions that I've been for a long time, accelerated change. You'll notice that I speak fast, although not as fast as I used to be. Okay? Because I have a health condition which has slowed me down a bit, but not as much as it might have. Okay? And everything seems to accelerate these days. Back in 2001, I wrote a book called Tyranny of the Moment, Fast and Slow Time in the Information Age, which was about the way in which information technology transforms our perception of time. And this was still early days, 2001. We still didn't have Facebook. The mobile phone was mostly used for talking and some very primitive games, such as Snake. But text messages was something that, I mean, adolescents sent text messages. Adults didn't send text messages back in 2000. So there's been a lot of change even since then. So I've been interested in this for a very long time. Now globalization. This is a book about globalization, overheating. It was a word that came into fashion around the year 1990. No coincidence, and I'm coming back to that in a little while. The point is that since then, we've seen a flood of publications about globalization. I mean, conferences. There was a time, it seemed, in the 1990s where it was impossible to have an academic conference in the humanities and social sciences without the words global, culture, and identity in the title, in any given order. And some of my colleagues disparagingly said back home in anthropology, people who did small-scale societies in South America and Indonesia, you know, this is a passing fad, it's going away. It's not going to last, this obsession with globalization. But it has, because it's become the air that we breathe. But the question I'm getting at is, so, yes, we've been talking about, discussing, critiquing, and even celebrating globalization now for 25 years. So is there anything new to say about it? Is there anything to say about globalization that hasn't already been said? I don't know. It's up to you to judge when I've finished my talk. But I've got my perspective, which at least has the virtue of being my own. And I think I should start the lecture proper by referring to the greatest anthropologist in the 20th century, who was born in Brussels in 1908 and who died in Paris in 2009, Claude Lévi-Strauss. On his 100th birthday, Lévi-Strauss, he was a great anthropologist, but he was a completely different kind of anthropologist from me, okay? But that's good, you know, to have diversity. We like that. On his 100th birthday, in 2008, he was visited by the then president, Sarkozy, who made sure that there were some journalists coming along with him, you know, taking photos and writing little reports. Because France is one of the few countries in the world, it sounds almost surrealistic today, you know, but it's one of the few countries in the world where a politician may still gain some symbolic capital, some prestige, by associating with intellectuals. It's surreal, you know, when you live in a different country. So France is a bit exceptional in that sense. So he came to visit Lévi-Strauss. Lévi-Strauss, 100 years old. He didn't say much. After all, he was 100 years old. But he said a few things. And one of the things he said that caught my attention at the time and my imagination was, Le monde maintenant est trop plein. Le monde est trop plein. The world is too full. It's too full of people. It's too full of their frantic projects. It's too full of change, modernization, mobility, the obliteration of boundaries between cultures. And it's so full, in fact, that the peoples to which he had devoted a lifetime to study, namely the small stateless peoples of the world, were about to disappear from the face of the earth as he was watching. To me, the fact that the world is too full is in fact, or rather the world is full, it's accelerating, is not necessarily something that we should bemoan. It's rather something that we need to explore and something that we need to understand and we need to come to terms with. So that's what we've been doing in the overheating project. Now what is it? I'll give you some Yeah, I'll tell you some stories eventually. But that was a starting point. That's probably when overheating began, when I read this little notice in, I think in Libération or something, about Lévi-Strauss and his statement about the world being too full. And I thought, what can we do with this as social scientists? The fact that the world seems now to be full. The concept of the Anthropocene would be familiar to many of you. The Anthropocene as a new geological era where every square kilometer, every square inch, in fact, of the planet is somehow affected by human activity. Even places where no human being has ever set foot, the Antarctic, a deep forest, is affected by human activity owing to climate change and pollution, runoffs, etc. So the world is now integrated in a way that it has never been before in history. So the world, in a sense, is becoming one place, and it's interconnected. My take, when I say overheating, is that change, which has always been part and parcel of modernity, and which has always has its detractors, has accelerated. And it's accelerated in a very dramatic way only in the last 25 years. In a number of different domains, but interrelated, change has accelerated in the last 25 years. So I would say that if I were to choose 1 year as a starting point for the 21st century, it would be 1991. 1991 marked the beginning of the 21st century. And let me briefly tell you why. 1991, an unsung year in the history of humanity. And I'll just give you a few examples. I can't run through the entire story about 1991 because I'm really going to talk about 2016. But it started, that's when it started, the deregulation of the global economy. It had been coming for some time, during the 1980s, with the policies which are now known widely as a neoliberal, but it exploded in the early 1990s. Not least owing to the deregulation of the Indian economy under Rajiv Gandhi in 1991. The opening up, the integration of the world's markets happened in 91. 91 was the end of the Cold War. All of a sudden, the politics that I had grown up with, where geopolitics, world politics, was largely defined through the tension between East and West, between socialism and capitalism, and where every decent country seemed to try to find the third way between, as it were, the extreme sort of individualism and insecurity of America and the extreme unfreedom and security of the Soviet Union. All of a sudden, there was no third way because there was only one. And what happened with ideology seemed for a while to be that the outcome was the sound of one hand clapping. We now see that this was not quite the case. What we rather see is that there seems to be a different kind of conflict, which is not easy, it's not so easily defined as being to do with the left and right in politics, to do with identity, right, and with openness and closure, and with cosmopolitanism and nationalism and that sort of thing. But that's a different story. The end of the Cold War, all of a sudden, the bipolar world of the post-war era had disappeared. Yeah, it started to happen a couple of years earlier, I know that. But 1991 was a year in which the Soviet Union officially ceased to exist. 1991 was also the year of the internet. Now, again, the internet had existed and in embryonic form for at least 20 years, but it became commercialized in such a way that Mr. and Mrs. Smith could walk into a shop and buy themselves a subscription to America Online and start to not surf the web, because the web hadn't been invented yet. The web was invented the year after, or it became available the year after. But they could start to exchange files and send email and so on. So it was the beginning of the privatization, as it were, of the internet. 1991 was also the year in which the new mobile phones started to become widespread in many countries. The new mobile phones, which were not the kind of phones that some of us remember, that taxi drivers and professional drivers had, salesmen and so on, which needed a transmitter that filled up half the trunk of the car in order to function. And the phone itself was about this big, and it weighed 1.5 kilos, right? So it was a murder weapon. From one day to the next, you could stand, as I did, you could stand under a mango tree in Mauritius and call your mum. 5 years earlier, it would take me a full day to call my mum from Mauritius, where I had my ethnographic fieldwork. And what the mobile phone has done to human communication, I mean, we still have only partly understood, and it's still evolving, right? So these were some of the events. I could mention some other events as well, but I won't because I'll be running out of time. And I still haven't quite explained overheating. Okay, but this was the beginning. 1991 was the beginning. And we now see the fruition of this. Overheating is not merely about climate change, although it's part of it. Overheating is about what happens when you rub your hands together like this, really fast. They warm up, and they generate friction and heat, right? And if you could do it really quickly, they'd eventually burn up. But of course, we can't do that because we have a biological thermostat which tells us when to stop. We're simply not capable of burning our hands by rubbing them together. The question is the planet, is the world economy, is the world of identities, and the world of climate change and the environment, are they capable of knowing when to stop? Probably not. So some of these escalating changes that we've seen, they don't have a natural thermostat. They have, if I were to use a PowerPoint presentation, I could have done that, but it would have been very boring because all the slides would have looked the same. They would all have looked like this, you know, with steep growth. You can take many domains to exemplify overheating in the contemporary world since the early 1990s. And I'm not even mentioning information technology because it's too obvious, you know, the number of computers, the number of smartphones. But I'll mention it even so because back in 2007, I wrote a book about globalization where I made the point that in sub-Saharan Africa, bar South Africa, which has a different history, having been an industrial country for more than a century, the proportion of people with access to the internet was less than 2%. This was 2006, 2007. And 7 years later, when I had to revise this book for the second edition, checked up on the statistics again, and now the figure was somewhere between 25 and 30%. And what has happened in those 7 years is not that most Africans have got laptops, but that they have smartphones, right? Which have been shipped in from China in most cases. So that's, you know, so that was just one aside about information technology. But let's leave the information technology to one side. Now, the driving force in modernity, the kind of modernity that we enjoy and that we relish and in which we somehow swim, is the modernity of energy, of fossil fuels, mainly. Maybe that's going to change, I don't know. But so far, it's fossil fuels. Only between 2003 and 2013, global coal exports doubled, right? The global coal exports doubled between 2003 and 2013 in 10 years. Indonesia, which had been a non-entity in the world of fossil fuels, all of a sudden was the world's largest exporter of coal. And this happened like this. You know, it happened almost, I wouldn't say overnight, but in the space of a few years. So change can take place in really fast ways. And it's no coincidence that I talk about coal. And there's a lot of coal in this book as well, okay? I write about coal because it has been the engine of modernity, eventually supplemented, but not replaced by oil and other sources of cheap and accessible energy. It's been immensely important, and it's impossible to understand the way in which global population has increased sevenfold since the Napoleonic Wars, without taking into account that global energy consumption has increased by a factor of 30 in the same period. Increased by a factor of 30 in the same period. And what is so hard for us to get our heads around, and maybe we can discuss that later on, is what I call the central double bind of overheated modernity. The central double bind of overheated modernity. Namely the fact that cheap and available and accessible fossil fuels, which have been the lifeblood of modernity, which was the salvation of humanity everywhere, almost, is now slowly dawning upon us that it's becoming our damnation because it's undermining the conditions for its own existence. Our civilization is undermining the conditions for its own existence. And it's very hard to grasp this both conceptually and not least to transform it into some kind of sensible politics. So that's one way of starting to talk about overheating, is actually to begin 200 years back and look at the growth in fuel consumption. And it's grown fairly healthily since 1990 as well, the consumption of fossil fuels. But let me give you a few other examples as well, just to illustrate that, in fact, overheating is something that we see in many domains. I could have spoken about, but I don't think I will, I'll say a few words about it anyway, about cities. In 2007, for the first time in human history, more than half the population of the world lived in cities. Right? So urbanization had really started to take off, and it's continuing. Right? More than half the human population lived in cities. So we have cities now that many of us haven't even heard of, which have several million inhabitants, several million people. You have cities which used to be little oases in the desert, intended for nomads to come in and for a few French colonial administrators to go about their work, and who have, I'm thinking about places like Nouakchott, the capital of Mauritania, and which today, they were dimensioned for a population of somewhere between 30 and 50,000, and which today have a population of something like 2 million, right? Or maybe more. Nobody really knows how many people live in cities like Mogadishu and Nouakchott. Nobody really knows how many people live in that continuous belt of urban squalor, if I may say so, stretching from Benin City to Accra, from Benin City in Nigeria to Accra. Nobody even knows how many people live there. Not to mention the coastal strip between Sao Paulo and Rio de Janeiro. So in other words, urbanization, but it's skewed, it's uneven, and it takes place mainly in the global south. We have cities in Europe which have existed since the Middle Ages. They say that Göttingen in Germany has existed probably since Roman times, continuously. There's been an urban place since Roman times, and it grows, but very sluggishly. I think Göttingen now has a population of somewhere between 70 and 80,000 people. It might have been 50,000, 200 years ago. It's growing at a very slow pace. I could have spoken about tourism. The number of international tourist arrivals, which has grown by a factor of 5, from 200 million to more than 1 billion since around 1980. And of course, I could have spoken about information technology, but I won't. The point is that these changes are taking place in a really fast way. And the question we're asking, one of the questions we are asking in the Earth-Eating project is, how can we connect these large-scale descriptions of the situation of the world with analysis of the way people live, people's life worlds? How do people respond? How do they react to these fast changes? For example, let me give you a few stories from our fieldwork around the world. In Gladstone, Queensland, where I have my fieldwork, in Australia, a society which in many ways resembles the European ones. There's a long-standing but sort of simmering, low-intensity conflict between some local farmers and a mine. Very common, because mines are infamous for using a lot of water. And Australians, as you would know, are obsessed with water. I mean, it's the only thing that's on their minds. When they talk about weather, it's all about water, because most of the time there isn't enough of it. And when they finally get some water, they get sort of 2 meters at once. So they either have drought or flooding much of the time in Australia. So they have an obsession with water. So these farmers, for a while, they could go to the mining company, and they could knock on the door, and they could speak to the managing director. And they could tell him that, look, we have evidence showing that you're pumping out a lot of groundwater, and it's depleting the aquifers that we rely on to carry out our work and to feed our cattle and so on. And then the manager, who knew them, he would say, yeah, he was a local. Yeah, Mr. Jones, I'll put this down here in my notepad, and I'll ring you up next week, and we'll find a solution to it. And he had to do it because he lived in the area, and he knew the farmers, and he felt a commitment to his local community. Now, a few years later, you go to exactly the same mine. The same people go to exactly the same mine, and they knock on the door. But the guy now sitting behind the desk is no longer a local. He's an Englishman who was hired from New Zealand and brought over by the new company, which is no longer a small-scale company, but one of the largest cement companies in the world, called Cement Australia. And they might say, I'm sorry, Mr. Jones, I can't help you with this because it's out of my mandate. I can't take a decision on this. But you can contact our main office in a different part of Australia. You can send them an email and send your complaint to our main office, and maybe they will respond to you. I'm sorry, there's nothing I can do. You see, what I call this kind of situation is a clash of scales, clashing scales, which I think goes a long way. As you would have noticed, I haven't even mentioned Brexit and Trump. But clashing scales, I think, is key to understand what's going on in certain parts of the European and North American populations, but also elsewhere. The feeling that Decisions are being taken very far away. Nobody asked me for my opinion. And then the big question would be that many people ask, whether they're in the Philippines or in Sierra Leone or in Peru, where we have our projects, who can I blame and what can I do when something goes wrong? So there's a similar story from Peru, also about mining, that I'd like to tell, where there was also a problem with water in highland Peru. Now, one thing is the melting tropical glaciers. It's one of those places in the world where you can actually observe, the effects of climate change. There was this mountain in the Colca area called, which was popularly known as La Ponchita Blanca, the white poncho, because she had this lovely white snow cap. They can no longer call her La Ponchita Blanca because she's no longer white. So that's clear that this water has disappeared. But other kinds of water also disappeared. Groundwater, the supply was more erratic, and a mine had just set up operation nearby. So people went to the mine. The local people, the mayor, everybody in the village, they sort of came to the mine and said, look here, you're taking our water, you're pumping out our water, we want compensation. Either you pay us money or you give us our water back. But then the mine may come out, or the mining executives, they come out and say, I'm sorry, we feel sorry for you, but it's not us, it's global climate change. And what you do then? Then the question is, what can you do? Yeah, maybe you can send an email to Obama, or to the Chinese, or to the Commission, and ask them to stop climate change so that they can get their water back. There's a huge sort of gap of scales here. Sometimes we just resign ourselves to the fact that there is a clash of scales, that things are just happening. Change is just flooding over us, and we have to make do as well as we might. In Sierra Leone, in rural Sierra Leone, where one of my PhD students is doing fieldwork. There had been, on the other side of this little creek where he lived, there had always been jungle on the other side of the creek. But one day the jungle was gone, and in a short while there was lots of activity going on in that area. And he was sort of peering across the creek and seeing that, yeah, they put up a fence with a sign, and he couldn't actually make out the letters because it was too far away. But he noticed that there were people inside the fence working on some project. They were sort of, they were hacking up, the ground, and they were burning, and they were starting to plant stuff. And after a while, some green stuff started to come up out of the ground. And he then noticed that the people working there, they were not Africans. They didn't look like Europeans either. It turned out they were Chinese. And the fact was that what had happened on the other side of this little creek was that they had set up a biofuel plantation. And he didn't know that. Then the anthropologist comes over and says, well, so how are things with you? And wow, what's happening here? The jungle is gone, and there's a kind of plantation here. So how can you explain this? How can you account for this? And the guy just shrugs and says, well, man, it's the global. It's the global. And one of the things that we need to find out is what exactly does he mean by that? What does he mean when he says, man, it's the global? I think what he means is that there are some enormous forces at play here that affect our everyday lives wherever we are. And we find it hard to know how to deal with them. Either you can try to resist them, as we've seen examples of in Europe recently. One thing is Brexit. Another thing is the fact that building fences along borders has become popular again. Something that we thought we were done with some time ago. And it's not just the Hungarians. It happened in Norway also, northeastern part of Norway, where there is a border with Russia, in a bid to prevent Syrian, Afghan, and Eritrean refugees from coming across. So you can try to do that. You can try to withdraw. You can try to play along, or you can try to find other ways of resisting it. But what I'm trying to get across to you when I talk about overheating is that this accelerated change that we see in so many domains, and I've only mentioned the fraction of the areas where we're seeing accelerated change, it's a result of you might say, if I were to be a little bit tabloid, because I'm running out of time, aren't I? Yeah. You didn't give me a sign, did you? Yes. No, okay, good. If I were to be a little bit tabloid, I'd say that, yes, there are, and this is not news to you, that there are two main driving forces that have created this situation of overheating. One being as I already alluded to, the deregulation of the global economy. I don't think the definitive book about the cargo ship and the shipping container has yet been written. I mean, there are some books about the shipping container, but it's crucial, I mean, in order to understand globalization. The shipping container, enabling people who produce Barbie dolls in China to sell them in Indiana, which wouldn't have been profitable only a generation ago because the transportation costs would have been too high. Even if you can produce them almost for free, it would have been cheaper to produce them in a small sweatshop or a small factory in Indiana itself. But owing to the dramatic transformation of shipping that has taken place in the last generation or so, transportation has become so cheap. So that's an important part of the story about global deregulation. And the second one is, I mean, it's a convergence between this and information technology and globalization of information technology. So who can we blame and what can we do? I think that at least one thing that we should be mindful of, and not least in a city like Brussels, one thing that we should be mindful of is the omnipresence of these clashing scales that I've spoken about. I wrote a short piece, if anybody is interested, about Brexit and clashing scales. You know, I think the people who voted for, personally, I think the people who voted for Brexit were misguided because they believed in some of the lies that were told them by irresponsible people. But the sentiment, the feeling that people had was that of clashing scales. I mean, look, I'm here, I live here in this local community. I'm being overrun by changes, all sorts of changes. And it's not merely about immigrants, it's about lots of other things. It's about job loss. It's about the arrogance, as it were, of the so-called elites who don't really care about us. And now we need to resist them, and we need to show them our voice. Nobody listens to us. We don't really have a say. And decisions are being taken in faraway places, as in the example from Queensland, you know, where all of a sudden there wasn't a local bloke anymore who could ring you up and find a way of dealing with the matter. It was some faraway office in a different part of Australia, and they would probably never respond to an email or a letter from a small group of farmers in Mount Larkham, central Queensland, anyway. So this feeling is becoming endemic, and it creates resentment. And the kind of resentment it has created, at least that would be my personal view. I haven't written much about it here because this book was completed last year. Had it been completed this year, I would have had probably a chapter or half a chapter on these kind of reactions. And the kinds of reactions we have typically seen, what used to be called ethno-nationalism, sometimes even xenophobic racism, and which is now called nativism. A kind of a nostalgic reaction for sure, but also an attempt to regain some kind of control over your own life. And to tell the elites in the center, be they in Westminster or in Brussels or in Oslo or elsewhere, that they can bugger off. Because we have now decided that we're going to have our own voice. The question is, what are the alternatives to this kind of response? What are the more constructive alternatives? And I'd say, yeah, there are a couple of things I would say. Quite clearly, overheating is unhealthy. Not only because it's destroying the planet, which it is, okay, because of climate change, and because of the depletion of important resources. It's taking me simply too fast. But it's also unhealthy because it's psychologically difficult, and it's psychologically and socially almost impossible for us to adjust adequately when changes are taking place at this kind of speed. So cooling down, finding ways of cooling down. Now keep in mind that there is a dialectics here. And if you read the book, you'll find that I haven't forgotten about that. There's a dynamic relationship between overheating and cooling down. Very often, when something heats up, something else cools down. And there are large parts of the world where the problem is not overheating in the sense of frantic activity and too much investment and too many people coming in doing things, but the opposite, not enough happening. Rural Poland, rural Kenya, etc. So by all means, but on the whole, at the planetary level, we need cooling down, slowing down. And perhaps we need to find ways of scaling down that do not pander to neo-nationalism and do not somehow have this kind of regressive quality that we see in identity politics around the world now. withdrawal. I mean, I've alluded to Trump and Brexit, but I think, you know, we should also be aware of the role of Islamic revitalization among Muslims in many parts of the world, which is also an attempt to regain some kind of control over your life. At the cost of excluding others and at the cost of somehow relinquishing some of the most cherished values of modernity to do with individualism and freedom of thought. So here's the puzzle. And I think that's a big question. That's a big question mark. I have a few solutions here, but not big ones. I don't know. I don't think there's a magic button. But I believe that is the big question. What kind of solutions can we find to overheating when the result of overheating is alienation and clashing scales and the sense that one is not properly being heard? You know, in the European Union, I was one of the 3 people on the Norwegian left who was in favor of membership in the European Union back in 1994. So whenever there was a meeting, I was called in, you know, and I debated with people on radio. And I made quite a few enemies. People who couldn't understand, why is this decent person in favor of the European Union? And I had several reasons, mainly because I saw it largely as a political project, as an identity project, as a project in which you could be different things. You didn't just have to invest your identity in one sort of slot. But there were also other, I think, important reasons that we need to get our act together as Europeans. And I also saw it not as a replication of uniformity, but as the organization of diversity, which is something very different. But at the time, there was a slogan, very popular term, which was being used all the time in Brussels, namely subsidiarity. The idea that any political decision should be taken as closely as possible to the people who are affected by the decision, as far down in the hierarchy as possible. Originally, it's the concept from Catholicism, and it was promoted at the time in no uncertain terms as part of the identity of Europe, as a place where you could organize diversity, which was decentralized, where you had the engine room here in Brussels, but where a lot of power was devolved and it was decentralized, and there was local autonomy and empowerment of communities. So maybe we should sort of dust off the concept of subsidiarity and see where that brings us, given what I've said about problems of legitimacy owing to clashing scales and the feeling that decisions are being taken far away by people who don't care about us. So on that note, I end, and I thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to discuss this or anything else in a little while. Thank you.